Hi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jameson Dempsey, and I'm an associate at Kelly, Dry & Warren in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming to Internet Everywhere, the role and policy implications of public Wi-Fi in New York City. So we have a very large panel, as you can see, and a number of issues to cover, so I'm not going to take up all too much of your time. But I briefly wanted to thank those who made this evening possible. So first, I'd like to thank eBay New York City, the Friends of eBay, and Mark Kinney from Supply. I don't know if Mark's around. There he is right there. For this terrific space, and also for the beer and the pizza, which I'm sure will fuel an awesome Q&A later. I'd like to thank Antonio Valenti from Hinchcraft Studios. He came out from New Jersey tonight to provide us with the sound equipment on pretty short notice, and so we're really thankful for him. So if we can give Antonio a round of applause. No need. And then we have a number of sponsors for tonight's event. I'd like to thank, first and foremost, New York Law School, Jen Bake and Michael Santorelli, who've been integral in the planning of this event. New York Legal Hackers, Warren Allen, Phil Weiss, and Tarek Badat have been terrific. And you'll hear from Warren and Tarek, a little bit later. I'd like to thank the Brooklyn Law Incubator and Policy Clinic, and my mentor and friend, Jonathan Ashkan, who should be here a little bit later. But he has been a terrific mentor and friend to many of us, and is the reason why many people in the room are interested in these policy issues and telecommunications. I'd like to thank the Cardozo Cyber Law Society, David Collado, and Danny Weiss. Danny's clapping for himself, and he's the only one. And I'd also like to thank my firm, Kelly, Dry & Warren, some of my mentors in the firm, John Heitman, Steve Augustino, and Tom Cohen, who gave me the opportunity to help put this event together and to come up here and share the experience with you tonight. Finally, I'd like to thank the New York chapter of the Federal Communications Bar Association, the FCBA. Jen Costu and Susanna Zwirling should both be here tonight. They've been very supportive of these events and have led the New York chapter with aplomb, and we're very thankful for them and for their support. And with that, I'd like to make a little FCBA pitch as a member myself. So for those of you who haven't already, I'd encourage you to join the FCBA. It's a volunteer organization of attorneys, engineers, consultants, economists, government officials, and law students who are involved in communications and information technology, law, and policy. FCBA has something to offer nearly anyone, and in many of the tech communities throughout the country. I know that I've learned a lot from the FCBA. I've made many friends through the FCBA, and the professional rewards far outstrip the modest membership fee. So if you have some time afterward, I encourage you to check out fcba.org, see what the FCBA has to offer. We should be offering more events like this in the near future, and we'd love to have you. And now I'd like to turn to our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is Councilmember Gale A. Brewer. Councilmember Brewer has been representing the Upper West Side and the northern part of Clinton in the New York City Council since 2002. Her service in the council is a continuation of nearly 40 years in public service. Brewer currently chairs the Committee on Governmental Operations after having chaired the Committee on Technology and Government, which is now the Committee on Technology, from 2002 to 2009. As Government Operations Chair, Brewer works to review government structure and organization with an eye toward increasing both efficiency and accountability, particularly in the delivery of services and the use of technology. Since taking office, Brewer has worked to make better use of technology to save money, to improve city services, and to bring residents, businesses, and nonprofits closer to government and their communities. Brewer is also the only city council member to publish an education newsletter that highlights all the information and programs for every public school in her district. Brewer co-chairs the Manhattan delegation, sits on the council's budget negotiating team, and is a member of the Rules Committee Working Group. Brewer has been instrumental in passing numerous laws, including legislation to open all city databases to the public, requiring landlords to repair underlying conditions that cause repeat housing violations, a ban on smoking in New York City parks and beaches, a law protecting domestic workers, a bill establishing the Broadband Advisory Committee, a bill establishing the electronic death registration system, 2 bills aimed at eliminating graffiti and unwanted stickers, and legislation requiring city publications to be made available on the web. We're honored to have Councilmember Brewer here tonight, and we'd like to thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I'm truly humbled to be here tonight, and this is a big honor. I certainly want to thank James, the Federal Communications Bar Association, hosts at eBay, but most specifically Michael Santorelli from the New York Law School. He's a friend, and he kindly invited me, and I am deeply appreciative. I'm going to try to give a little history. I was talking to David earlier, and we realized that in 2002, when I first was elected, I took over the Technology Committee, and I must admit, it's one of those committees at City Hall that people say, why in the world do you want to do that? Why don't you want to do land use or finance or something like that? But since I started in government many years ago, I always believed that government information should be public. And now that sounds like a norm, but guess what? It's often not. And so I used to build kiosks. I remember IBM let me build some kiosks in front of City Hall in the mid-1990s that would give information about what was going on in city government. And then I built the first city online green book, which was like also in the mid-90s from scratch, when there was no off-the-shelf information. So I always was in government, although sometime in the real estate affordable housing world, and always teaching at CUNY, but I always thought that's what government should be doing, which is telling the public information that they're already paying for and they should know about. So that's where my interest comes from. I have not even half or a quarter or a minutia of the information that you have in terms of how to pull all this off, and that's why I'm particularly humbled. But given all of that background, I really loved the Technology Committee, and there were a group of us in the early 2000s that were like a posse. We would go everywhere together, and I'll talk about it. Now, thank God, the whole city is involved. So if you're going to talk about public Wi-Fi, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did historically in the last 10 years, wireless and broadband, and just some of the initiatives that we took, which I suppose now seem like old history, but it gives you a sense of what has taken place and then what needs to happen. We passed a law in 2005 that talked about a broadband advisory committee. And all that meant was, first of all, most of my colleagues, and I'll get in trouble for this, had no idea what broadband is. We had to go to Bruce Regan and say, what is broadband? They had no clue. But the good news is between the mayor and the city council, we went to all 5 boroughs, and we met with small businesses, we met with nonprofits, we met with individuals. And in the mid-2000s, nobody really understood what the libraries were doing in terms of this issue, or what was going on in terms of small business and how we could get faster capacity. And the schools were trying hard to just be able to deal with some of the videos that the kids were doing. So it was a different kind of time, literally only 5 or 6 years ago. But I think it focused the issue that the city of New York was interested in hearing from New Yorkers about what their concerns are. I think the best was the Brooklyn Public Library story. Sometimes I thought there were drug dealers outside of the Brooklyn Public Library, but it was just people looking for free Wi-Fi. And literally, people came to the hearing wondering what they were doing outside the library in Brooklyn. And so we had to explain it, but that's the depth of how different 5 years ago was. And so I think as a result of all of that, we looked to see how we could increase the broadband adoption rate. We also got a wonderful study that the Economic Development Corporation did with the organization of consultants. Chris O'Brien, who'd been the CIO of Chicago, had a firm. Some of you remember all this. And we were able to show there's a lot of broadband capacity, but a lot of people can't pay for it. And all of this led to, I think, discussions about the franchise, and I think it helped when Corporation Counsel and DoITT had to negotiate with the cable companies and Verizon to know what was out there and what was needed. And one of the issues, again, seems like a long time ago, was trying to get some free Wi-Fi in the parks and trying to understand what that meant. And there were some, as Dana knows and NYC Wireless knows, there were some strange attempts, that we thought would work and didn't. The best of all was the Parks Commissioner, and this is a true story. We were talking about Wi-Fi in the parks and hotspots. He didn't know what it was, and he turned red. I'm talking beet red. He had no idea what a hotspot was in terms of what we were talking about. He thought it meant something else. That's the level on which we were operating 5 years ago. And so we tried to find a way in which the Wi-Fi could exist in some of the larger parks. NYC Wireless worked with the city and Parks Department and tried to bring it into the parks that were smaller, and there were issues of insurance, there were issues of not quite understanding what the purpose of what we were trying to accomplish was. And again, this is all historic. Today there's a contract with AT&T for some parks, Time Warner, and others. We can talk about that in a little while. But the whole notion was the franchise discussions were ongoing, very delayed, because I think DoITT and Bruce will talk more about this, I'm sure, from Corp Counsel, trying to get as much as possible for the city, for the public access stations, for the libraries, for the schools, and trying to know that we have just one opportunity for doing that in a long franchise. But during this time period, we were, again, trying to raise all the issues that needed to be raised. And I know in 2011, the mayor and AT&T announced a public-private agreement that will bring, and does bring, free Wi-Fi to 20 city parks in all 5 boroughs. At the same time, we were talking about the subways. As we all know, there's not a lot of cell or Wi-Fi access. The MTA had partnered with Transit Wireless to provide 3G and Wi-Fi access in select subway stations. And I think you'll find that, with 270 underground stations in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, and the Queens, we hope that there will eventually be wireless service available to all the billions of riders every single day on the platforms. But there was a moment when Google called me, and now we were not in the high chain of command in terms of technology, but they called us. This is, again, history, because they couldn't get the MTA, can you imagine, to return their call regarding Google Maps and trying to find a way to use it to be able to help riders figure out where they were going. Really, it took Google about a year to get the MTA to call them back. And again, just so you know, that's exactly what happened. And I was trying to call, here I am, a council member, it was hysterical, calling the MTA, would you mind calling Google back? Because they would actually like to help you in helping riders know where they are going. That is a true story. And I think, and then Rachel Stern was the first chief digital officer, and I remember, and I know all the work that she's been doing trying to get new talent to come to New York, but I do remember some of the hearings we had with some of the new startups, before 2008. And literally, they couldn't find an engineer in New York. They would come and they would state, I have a new startup, I just don't have anybody to work with me. And again, that seems like ancient history, although it's still a challenge, but that was the level on which we were operating. I love going to some of the big apps competitions, and I think I went to 3 of them at least, and it was always exciting to see some of you and others and the work that gets done, but then I always worried about, all those other databases that weren't getting considered. And I think it's really important, and I'm doing this in a humorous fashion, to find a parking space, although I can find my own parking space. I don't need an app for a parking space, but I understand that it is something that people might want to use. I'm more interested in knowing where are the Section 8 apartments, how do we get homeless people homes, and things like that. So we did pass, with the mayor's assistance, and certainly I want to give a shout out to Carol Post when she was head of DoITT, to be able to pass our open data law. This was huge. It took a group of people working in government information, government transparency, and hundreds of hours working with the city agencies to come up with the open data law. It is Local Law 11. It passed in 2012. And basically, it's the most comprehensive listing of databases anywhere in the country. It basically states that anything that's on nyc.gov has to be up on the city's portal, and we're going to keep expanding it. If an agency has not put their data up there, then by the end of September of this year, they have to explain why, and there are some more dates and benchmarks as we go forward. I think the challenge is not for you, But for community boards and community people is to figure out how to use all of that data, and that's something that we need to do some training on. I also just want to mention that, and it has a technical standards manual that goes with it. Suffice to say, it was a very proud moment for me and all the people we worked with, including the agency, to come up with something that I think will be available into the future. And I think that DoITT staff did a great job of building the portal so it's sustainable and can be kept updated, which is incredibly important. I want to mention just two other things. One is the role of the nonprofit community in all of this. One of the things we learned in going around to the broadband hearings is the role of the nonprofits in all of this. And I take some credit because in doing so, we learned that there were just a few working in the schools, working with seniors, and they were really struggling, but had a lot to offer. And so we realized that one of the challenges is parents and students and home don't always work in terms of technology. You can have support at school, but there's nothing happening in low-income families at home. Same thing with seniors, one of the fastest growing populations to get on the net, but didn't really know what to do or how to do it, but they wanted to. So we raised, I think it was, I'll get corrected, around $48 million grant. It was written by a guy named Bruce Lai, who was actually my chief of staff, and then went to the Department of Education. DoITT and the DOE worked really hard on this. And the fact of the matter is that $48 million has literally helped thousands and thousands of middle school parents and students with Computers for Youth and Mouse, and with an organization called OATS, and seniors. And as we sit here today, these organizations have literally changed, I think, without having a big press conference, the way in which people approach technology in low-income communities in the city of New York. And I think we should be very proud as New Yorkers that this is something that we have not forgotten. And I take a lot of credit, I think, in terms of when we were early on working on technology, this was part of our posse. These organizations were part of our posse, and I was so glad they were able to get the funding, and I know we'll work to try to make them sustainable into the future. So I think I want to say in closing, there are conferences coming up, there's tonight, there's the amazing work that's going on with universities that are going to be part of the future. They're going to be looking particularly at some of the young people participating in STEM, which you all know is mathematics and science and technology, and there are high schools that are thinking about this. There's relationships between associate degrees and high schools trying to think of what is the next wave in terms of jobs and opportunities. Even I was at a meeting today with CWA, which is the union working with Verizon, and they indicate that there are only 75 Verizon employees working on wireless right now, as we sit here tonight. Tons more need to be hired. A lot of people, of course, are still working in the wired world at the union. And this is just one example of where so much more needs to be done. I want to mention one other thing, which is that the city, too, is trying to figure out between their new ideas for payphones and their new ideas for other ways in which wireless can be used to further access from the public. There's a RFP out, which I think has been answered, and there's a lot of creativity going on for our payphones. We can't forget that we need a payphone, but many of us would also like to have it be a wireless opportunity right there. And at the same time, trying to think of other places where the two can combine, where I guess my interest is trying to find ways that all New Yorkers can participate. If we can't have a municipal Wi-Fi, which is another whole discussion that I hope we'll have at some point, I think I got convinced that it's not necessarily possible, but I'm always dreaming. Then how do we do it to make sure these communities aren't left out? So I do want to thank you all for this opportunity. I know that you'll have a lot more to contribute than I could ever possibly, but I do want you to know that some of us in this room and others were part of the original tech posse. And I'm so excited that so many people are involved, and I know it'll take us to great places in the future. This is an incredibly exciting conference. Thank you, Michael Santorelli.
And thank you, Council Member Gale Brewer, everyone. My name is Warren Allen, as Jameson mentioned. I am the head of the New York Legal Hackers Meetup. And I do not want to be standing between you and this awesome panel. So I'm just going to put a quick plug in for what we do. We organize events based around this effectively in areas where law isn't keeping up with technology. We look at all different kinds of areas. We've looked at patent trolls, we've looked at immigration, and we have a lot more on the horizon. So definitely check us out. Google Legal Hackers. You'll find us on meetup.com. Join us and check out more of these awesome events. And thank you again to everyone who's made tonight possible. I just wanted to introduce very quickly our panel. You can read more about them on the Eventbrite. What I say will not remotely do them justice. But first, just starting at the end, we have Deirdre Flynn, who's the Executive Director of Telecommunications Policy and Strategy at New York City DoITT. Right next to her, we have Michael Santorelli, who's Director of the Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute at New York Law School. Further down, we have Mike Roudi, SVP of Corporate Development at Time Warner Cable. Further down, we have Joe Plotkin, who's a board member of NYC Wireless, a nonprofit organization that advocates for free public wireless networks, and he is also a director at ASA Networks, a wireless internet service provider. In the middle, we have Nilay Patel, who is our moderator tonight. He's managing editor of The Verge, a former attorney, and he writes awesome stuff on the intersection of law and policy. To his left, we have Bruce Regal, who I should know because I've worked with him before, senior counsel at the New York City Law Department, and he has served as the city's lead attorney on telecommunication matters since 1989. To his left, we have Jody, Westby, CEO of Global Cyber Risk. She's an author, she's an adjunct professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and she's also a professional blogger at Forbes. We have Ashkan Soltani, who's an independent research and consultant specializing in consumer privacy and security on the internet. He recently testified as an independent expert in front of the Senate Commerce Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee. And to his left, we have Christopher Soghoian, who's the principal technologist and senior policy analyst at the ACLU. Thank you to all our panelists, and have at it, guys. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm vastly outclassed here. I'm a failed lawyer, which I shouldn't be in this room at all. But I've been asked to moderate this really intense and wonderful panel. And I'll just set the stage here a little bit. We had a phone call to just sort of plan out what we were going to talk about. And that phone call erupted into what should have been the panel. Because this group of people is very smart and they have some really great opinions. And the one thing that came out of that call a few days ago that I thought we would just begin with, and it's going to sound like a really simple and stupid question, but I assure you it is not simple to answer, is simply what should our working definition of public Wi-Fi be? What is it that we're trying to build? And because we can't answer the question of who's responsible, who's going to pay for it, who's liable for what happens on it, until we know what we're talking about. So does someone want to volunteer a first stab at a definition of public Wi-Fi that we can use? And I can just call on one of you. Is that, wow. Are we shy? There's beer over there. We can come back in 5 minutes. Deirdre, do you want to start? No, thank you. Oh, Joe Plotkin.
Hi, I'm Joe Plotkin. As he said, I guess we could start with what it's not, maybe.
Sure.
In the early days, Gale took us down memory lane there for a little while. It was fun. And she's right. She was integral to all of this getting started. She was instrumental. But in the early days, there was a lot of overpromise with public Wi-Fi. It was going to be the panacea. It was going to solve the digital divide. It was going to, do your laundry for you. It was going to do everything. And we saw that that resulted in some tremendous flameouts, most notably in Philadelphia. So the question now is, what are we looking to do with Wi-Fi? And I would say a good definition of public Wi-Fi is any publicly available Wi-Fi that moves us towards ubiquity of open access to the internet.
So I guess, do we have any responses to that before I move on? So my question to you then would be, does AT&T building out a Wi-Fi network for its customers count, where you can pay to use it sometimes and those customers get faster access?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I thought so.
To the degree that it's open to the public without obligation of being a customer, if they have that, then it adds to, all of these things add in a positive direction. Would it be better if it didn't have the restrictions? Certainly.
So let me ask Mike Roudi from Time Warner. Sure. Your company is building out a lot of Wi-Fi networks.
Absolutely.
Do you think that the obligations of your company when you build those networks should be the same as when the city builds its networks?
No.
Okay, well, I get why? I mean, but that doesn't.
much more
I thought you might want me to elaborate on that.
But
no,
that doesn't square with.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Okay.
So, I obviously, public tends to always be synonymous with free. We, as an access provider, as the folks that do all the physical investment in the networks and do the deployments, that we obviously build these with purpose, right? We build them so we can acquire customers, and we think about Wi-Fi. I apologize for moving hands. I'm Italian, and it keeps going. But we think about Wi-Fi as a true extension of our high-speed data network. So as we build Wi-Fi, and last year we built a very large network in Los Angeles. We're planning to do the same thing here in New York City in 2013. We think about it as an extension of our product offering to the million plus high-speed data customers that we have. So as I think everybody knows, the networks themselves are incredibly expensive, right? The cost of building facilities and putting what we always talk about internally, putting plant in the ground, is a process that we, as frankly, as a for-profit company, we build this because our customers have incredible value, and we want to keep them truly connected to the internet. So the idea of having the same set of rules and policies is just inconsistent.
So I guess my next question would be, I'm going to direct it towards this side. If there is, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, but if there is such a value to for-profit companies like Time Warner, Verizon, and AT&T, and there is a market that is driving them to build these networks, why should municipalities and communities and governments be involved in building them to begin with? Yeah.
There are going to be some people who aren't able to afford the services that these companies offer, and those people shouldn't have to go to the public library to use the internet. They should be able to go to other places. If you want to be able, if we think that people with wealth and means should be able to wander the streets of New York and get online, I think everyone in the city should be able to wander the streets of the city and get online too. This is an issue of equality. I think at the end of the day, internet access is not a luxury anymore, and those without means shouldn't be tethered to the library.
But aren't there, you still need devices, right? You still need a Wi-Fi enabled device, a tablet, a laptop, what have you. And the poor segments of society, the numbers indicate that they're getting online primarily through mobile broadband, right? From the wireless companies, not from Wi-Fi.
You can get a cheap smartphone, a cheap Android device that has Wi-Fi and 3G support for $100, but the monthly data charge is actually quite expensive. That can be $20, $30, or $40 a month for a prepaid plan. Obviously, the cheapest way for someone with low financial means to get online is going to be a cheap portable phone or cheap Wi-Fi capable phone, and then not the 3G data plan, but actually Wi-Fi service provided from other places for free.
So let's move forward towards this definition of public Wi-Fi, because it sounds like Time Warner would like us to excuse whatever open networks they build on top of their network for their subscribers, right?
I'm not sure we're saying they need to be excused. They're just not mutually exclusive. So, we build an example of what we do today is working with DoITT when we're building out the parks as well, and we're providing an offering of free Wi-Fi. It's capped, and it's capped time bound in terms of what we offer, but we allow people to come onto the network, use it, and then for our customers who are Time Warner Cable customers, they have unlimited access from a time standpoint, time and tonnage standpoint to use that same network, because that's part of the value of them being our customers. So that's my point on why I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. They clearly have to coexist. And
does that mean if someone changes their MAC address every half an hour, if someone changes their MAC address every half an hour, can they get online all day long?
no.
You require an authenticated login, even I thought anyone from the public can get online, right?
We ask for username and passwords to be set up, yeah.
Okay.
But so can you have multiple usernames and passwords?
They could.
Oh, so you're helping everyone then. It's great.
So Deirdre, let me ask you. So you did this in partnership with Time Warner, right? Part of it. So as you were thinking about how to best serve your large community, and you had this distinction between what they would offer their customers and what they were willing to offer the public, how did you go about thinking what the public network should look like for the citizens of the city versus those who are paying Time Warner?
So just to be clear, I did not do that thinking for that process, so I will defer to either Bruce or the people here this evening. But what I'd like to talk about is actually what we've done is what Gale had alluded to earlier in her remarks and what we've offered out through the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program.
Yeah.
Sorry. And we've actually offered out through all 5 boroughs, and we've been able to put up 100 centers, and we're having about 30 to 35,000 people a week go through our centers. So I'd like to thank all the people at the beginning, as Gale noted earlier, who had worked on this, because we now are able to deliver out through all 5 boroughs aggregation points so that all citizens will have access to technology as well as devices, because I think you made a great point earlier. It's not just the broadband, it's the device that you need to use to get onto it, and how do you use that and participate within all the government services that are to be offered.
Yeah, I mean, the devices are key, but yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to build on what Deirdre had just mentioned and to respond to what Chris said. I think this is, and what Gale, Councilmember Brewer, alluded to before, I think this is best seen as almost a teachable moment for people who aren't adopting broadband. The city's adoption rate is relatively low compared to the overall state level. Just some data I saw from a couple years ago. Certain segments, certain communities have lower adoption rates compared to the city average. And so there's been a lot of experimentation in the city, as Deirdre had mentioned, through DoITT, through these BTOP-funded programs, these outreach and education programs to engage these under-adopting communities, seniors, low-income households, to offer them or to provide them with a value proposition. And there's anecdotal evidence coming out now that shows that people who initially might have seen or had sticker shock at a broadband a subscription price for a monthly connection, once they see the value of investing in that, it's like anything else. If you perceive something to be not relevant to you, you'll see it as unaffordable at almost any price. But as you see it as more of something that you need in your life, you're willing to invest more in it. So I think the education outreach that's going on now is helping to bridge those divides. And I think that's an important part of this sort of conversation and sort of putting the Wi-Fi piece into context.
So I guess what I'm trying to get to here is I'm seeing Chris say this is more than a utility, it's a necessity. I think the ACLU has actually come out and said broadband access should be a human right? It's at that level. It's being connected to the internet is absolutely necessary to be a citizen.
I don't know if we've said that. We may have.
Perhaps somebody.
No, I haven't said that.
Well, the ACLU is big, and I talked to a lot of people. But I've heard that argument certainly advanced, right? That network access is a key condition of survival, and particularly I think in New York City, to get a job, to do all these things. It's incredibly important, right? But then we also have another level of broadband access, which is profit-taking, right? It's if you want to get even faster access, you want to stream videos in the park, well, that's probably not a human right? You probably need to start paying for that. So I guess I was going to ask you, Bruce, what were you thinking about when you thought about the level of acceptable access for Wi-Fi in the parks?
Well, I think whenever we start to
I'm sorry.
Whenever we start to entertain a potential Wi-Fi project, like the ones that we've done with Cablevision and Time Warner, like the project we've done with the Chelsea Improvement Company, with Google's assistance, like our project with AT&T. In each of these cases, part of the inquiry is we want to maximize the amenity that's going to be made available to the public. Mm-hmm. But we also have to recognize there has to be some kind of business plan that makes that amenity work. Amenities don't just fall out of the sky. Either the public has to put money into it, money that's limited, and that has to be, you have to decide whether you're going to spend it on affordable housing or other things that are necessary, or education, or Wi-Fi amenities. So you have to make those choices, or you find a business plan which is attractive to a potential provider, and you try and craft something which maximizes the amenity, but also gives enough back to whoever the provider is going to be in one form or another to help you craft something that again works from a business point of view. And the city is entertaining as many different creative approaches to do that as we can possibly think of, and we're exploring things, more and more different approaches all the time. Just to give a few examples, Gale mentioned a few, and a few have been mentioned as well. In the Chelsea neighborhood, with the financial support of Google and others, the Chelsea Improvement Company is providing free Wi-Fi to the neighborhood using access to city light poles and where they install their antennas. That's currently in a pilot stage. There's a one-year pilot underway. If that works out, we can extend it for another 4 years. So that's sort of in effect, and that's sort of the business improvement district kind of model, in which the real property owners and the businesses in the neighborhood want to improve that neighborhood, and they see a business benefit to doing that. So they're interested in sponsoring something with the city, and we're always happy to do those kinds of projects. So that's one kind of business model for an amenity of free Wi-Fi. AT&T has done a similar project with the city, free Wi-Fi in about 20 different parks across the 5 boroughs for a number of years, and they've committed to do that, and they've built out a successful network in various parks around the city. And again, AT&T came to the city and said, you know, we want to sort of develop goodwill with the city. We want to be a good citizen, and we're interested in helping do this type of service. How can we help you? And we indicated to AT&T that one of the important things to us was bringing this amenity to as many city parks as we could. So we worked out a transaction that allows people to use it for free. We're working with the public payphone providers at various public payphone locations as the payphones themselves have become less and less useful with the ubiquity of mobile phones. The payphone providers, who make a lot of money from the advertising that sits on the payphone shelters, are looking for continued reasons to maintain those facilities. So they have a business reason to continue in this marketplace. And this is another way that we can explore Wi-Fi. So we've now got free Wi-Fi antennas on some of the payphone locations around the city. Again, you look for the business plan that makes these kinds of amenities work. Time Warner and Cablevision and the deals that we reached in connection with the renewal of their cable franchises was another format where we tried to expand as much as possible the amenity for people using city parks. It's a different model in the sense that it's limited free time for those who want to sign up for it. It's unlimited for subscribers of Cablevision and Time Warner, which means half the city, in fact, has it on an unlimited basis for free. And the other half has free service for a limited period of time, and for 99 cents a day, you have unlimited use during the day. Transit Wireless is a company that is developing Wi-Fi and wireless in the subway stations around the city, and we've worked with Transit Wireless to make sure that they have the wired support to support that wireless program. They are also developing Wi-Fi applications to be applicable in the subway stations. So there's a lot of different projects and a lot of different creativity going into trying to find those places where we can make a business plan work to provide public amenity, and that's sort of the key.
So let me ask you, and let me shift to kind of the usage, because we've talked about why we might want to build this. We talked a little about how you're paying for it, a or how someone's paying for it. But now the question is, you've described a situation in which you have 4 different models.
And more coming.
More coming, and they're all backstopped by providers of some kind, right? AT&T, Time Warner, Cablevision. And you've got people coming on to use the network. And I actually want to ask you this, Ashkan. What are those companies' responsibilities? They're not necessarily consumers of the network, right? There's no customer relationship there necessarily. What are the security implications? How much are they required? Are they allowed to monitor the traffic? Are they allowed to see what those customers are doing? Did you talk about that as the city, or did you just let them use their best practices?
These are issues that are evolving, and that's part of the reason that we're piloting a lot of these programs, is we want to see how they work. We do talk to the companies about issues about security and privacy and marketing information and so on and so forth. And we do try and create some parameters around that. But again, these are experiments in large part. We're trying to learn how these things work, what the risks are, what the downsides are, and using that to hopefully develop an even wider application in the future. Right. And hopefully we can get comments from the panel about what kinds of things we should be thinking about as we do
I think you almost certainly will. Ashkan, I'm curious, what do you think the consumer implications are?
Sure. Just to kind of let me lead up to it. So I absolutely think the public wireless is a good idea. I think we've seen that if you want to engage on things like Obama's town hall, or if you want to engage on We Are the People, you need to be online, you need to participate, right? And wireless is great because it's lower barriers to entry, right? So you don't need to lay copper, you don't need to lay fiber. You can do mesh networking, which makes it quite cheap. It's potentially part of the reason you might see incumbents trying to move into this space. So Wi-Fi isn't AT&T's core business, right? It's actually just GSM-based networking, and part of the reason the incumbents want to come into the space is they realize that by leveraging municipalities' support or help, that they can quickly maintain their dominance, right? And from a public policy perspective, this is something as municipalities you want to consider, right? So we don't see a lot of kind of differentiation in policies around wireless carriers with regards to things like, unlimited bandwidth. Anonymity, security, this kind of stuff. And we have the potential with having a bunch of diverse solutions for wireless to promote different policy agendas. And then from a consumer perspective, I think you want to consider things like kind of security and privacy implications, especially as a government or municipality providing these services, right? So if I were to build a Muni line, a public railway, that traverses through the city, I would consider consumer safety as an issue, right? But if I'm providing just wireless access on an open wireless network without any considerations for things like security, I'm actually exposing consumers to potential risks like identity theft, security. And this is different than like a Starbucks wireless hotspot where you pop in for a few minutes and like open your laptop and check your mail. This is like people in Chelsea will be, setting up their home computers to route through this network and on a 24/7 basis, right? This becomes a big threat surface for people for attackers to man in the middle of your traffic, sniff your data, monitor your activities, even from a law enforcement perspective, being able to monitor consumers as they do whatever task, and maybe things that we think on the edge of the law. We see this in in the Six Strikes program for ISPs, right? So we want to consider, as governments that are supporting these programs, do we take into account the public policy considerations? Sorry, that was a little long-winded.
So we have sort of two primary concerns when it comes to these networks. The first is that government-run networks or government-blessed networks in the past don't have the best track record when it comes to censorship. So public or networks and computers provided at public libraries in many cases use internet filtering software. The New York Public Library uses WebSense and blocks certain websites. I know they block BitTorrent-related websites, but I think they probably block porn or some other content. Certainly they use WebSense to block material. Libraries around the country do so, and in fact, Congress passed a law requiring libraries that receive public funding to install filtering software, a law that the Supreme Court upheld. both Ashkan and I worked at the Federal Trade Commission just a few years ago, and the FTC's computers have filtering software on them as well, and most federal agencies do. Usually what happens is there'll be a scandal in which employees are caught browsing porn at work, and then members of Congress will demand strong filters to make sure that people are not wasting taxpayer dollars to look at porn at work. But it's important to differentiate between the networks provided to public employees and the networks provided to the public at places places where the government is either the ISP or is providing such resources to the ISP as to facilitate that. It's really important that people be able to access as much free speech enabling content as possible, and this isn't something that you should. Full access to the material on the internet shouldn't be a luxury. You should be able to access whatever legal content you want, whether you're at the library, whether you're at Starbucks, or whether you're on a T-Mobile prepaid connection. And right now, some ISPs either filter content by default or require consumers who don't want a filtered connection to opt out of the filter, which can in some cases be very sensitive or embarrassing, right? Do you want to call up your wireless carrier and say, excuse me, please opt me into porn?
Yes.
Well, maybe you're happy to do that, but many people are not. So the first thing, I guess, is ensuring that free speech is possible on the network and using the resources. The other big issue is anonymity. So it's actually really difficult to be anonymous online. It's difficult for technologists to be online. It's difficult for someone with my skills or Ashkan's skills to be truly anonymous. It's difficult for the director of the CIA or the CIA director's girlfriend to be truly anonymous online. And it is extremely difficult for the average person to be anonymous online. One of the few ways that you can actually sort of preserve some of your anonymity is to use the network at, say, a Starbucks or other place of public Wi-Fi that doesn't require you to log in with some kind of authenticated ID. I think that there are we get important things in our society. We get positive things when we facilitate and enable anonymous free speech. There are some views that you don't want to express if they're tied to your real name, if your Facebook photo shows up next to the comments. And it's really difficult to be anonymous from your home internet connection when your ISP retains logs of the IP address they give you, when they can be compelled to deliver those records to a civil litigant or to law enforcement. I think we do want to make it easy for people to be anonymous, and you shouldn't have to have a PhD in computer science to maintain that effective anonymity. Muni Wi-Fi networks or open Wi-Fi networks facilitate and enable that basic aspect to facilitate First Amendment communications.
So I think that there's a balancing there, right? I think there's a good that comes from anonymity. There's a good that comes from more pervasive access. But as Ashkan was saying, you increase the threat surface when you get people using these networks that aren't potentially as well maintained or as rigorously maintained as some of the private networks, particularly mobile networks, because AT&T and Verizon are very interested in maintaining the security of those networks. So Jody, I want to ask you, you do a lot of consulting and a lot of talking about risks in the digital world. How do you think the consumer who uses one of these public networks should think about their risk profile, particularly, as Chris says, it's very difficult for the average person to know all of the different ways that they're being exposed, their identity, their data.
Well, these networks certainly add to the livability of a city, but they also add, as Chris and others have pointed out, the opportunity. But there's also a huge opportunity that they provide to bad people. And Wi-Fi networks are basically unsecured. And even though we have wiretap interception laws, and they certainly apply to Wi-Fi networks, just because you're on a Wi-Fi network, no one has the right to intercept your communications. Nevertheless, they do it. And because the networks that are offered to the public are, in a magic term that Chris will understand, a communications provider to the public, they can have an exception where they can actually intercept your data to look at that or your content or whatever you're doing, but they can't disclose it. And so shame on Google for what they were doing when they were gathering up all this drive-by information. You know, they were really intercepting communications. And so part of establishing these networks, the part we've dropped off is the public education part. And there are some technologies that are not terribly expensive that allow people to sort of develop their own little VPN when they get on in hotspots. And there could be better enforcement in these hotspots, looking for people that are sitting there capturing information. Because when you think about it, I mean, now kids, my grandchildren, are running around with iPads. And you don't want your children sitting in a hotspot and enjoying their iPad and working and having predators or something trying to pick up information from what they're doing, or to pick up confidential information. When I work with executives and senior level in companies, they're now some of the biggest security risks to companies because they wander around and go into Starbucks and they sit down and they go to these hot spots that they sit there and do confidential transactions and those kinds of things. So there's education at all levels for all audiences, but it's very much a public obligation as well to educate the people in the hotspots of how to behave and to develop a culture of security, and also for our technology companies to develop some better mousetraps to help address this unsecure environment.
Yeah. So, is there any responses here? I want to make sure that.
You know, because Gale brought it up before, I mean, the analogy to the payphone comes to mind very quickly because, yeah, there are security concerns, but if somebody can't get online, those concerns are academic, right? So first you have to provide the ability to get online, and then you could teach them how to get online securely. Worrying about whether some nefarious use of that public Wi-Fi hotspot will happen is just like saying, well, somebody may have planned a bank robbery using a payphone. Okay, so what? It's not the payphone didn't cause the bank robbery any more than somebody using the internet to send email is going to cause whatever plot to develop. They're going to find, those people will find ways. They will find other hotspots somewhere, somehow. Trust me, they will communicate whatever they want to do.
There's no excuse not to do it. And you don't give people a car without a license. You don't give people other instruments without telling them how to use them. So I do think the obligation doesn't have to be secondary. It ought to be foremost when you establish Wi-Fi networks.
I think Ashkan wanted to add.
I mean, I'm not sure the payphone analogy maps as I would consider more as like a trolley in San Francisco, right? And so early days, people would fall off and break their necks, and they still run it for tourists, but there's much more safety concerns for people to use the system, right? Like, I think it's unlike a payphone in that by using a public Wi-Fi network without any security hygiene, you effectively expose yourself both to attacks to your personal computer as well as leakage of personal data about you, right? And so I think like many public projects, they're good ideas, but you want to bake it in from the start, and you don't want to kind of, so I'll give you, we were talking about parking earlier. Recently, I was poking around at an app, a parking app that is in 100 and something different municipalities that let people, I don't know if it's in New York, it's called Park Mobile. You can park using your mobile phone. And the municipality supported this private company to come in and enable all the parking meters so you don't have to carry quarters, because quarters are basically useless, right? But effectively, by doing this project, they didn't bake in any security into the app, and anyone could figure out where anyone else is parked at any given point in time, right? And you could actually park as other people, so you could, but they literally didn't, they're like, well, we're going to provide this service and we're going to get it out very quickly, and it's a great concept, but with no security or no privacy, there's literally no protections on consumers, right? And it doesn't take a PhD to do it. You could just poke at it and see that you could log in or see anyone else's parking status, right? So you get a lot of these like great ideas that I think you definitely want to get people online before you protect their privacy, or whatever, as you said. But I think you can do both at the same time, right? So you want to, in the processes of getting them online, make sure that they don't, crash and burn.
I think that's a great point, because in our programs where we're targeting 6th graders as well as transfer students and senior citizens, we are actually teaching people about the impact of being online and your online presence and being responsible on how you message about yourself and how you speak about others. We have programs talking about online bullying for all ages, and I think it's essential to let people know the impact of being online.
So I think education is great, but I think you can actually do things like bake in privacy and security into the, so like you can have an open network that when you connect, it says, please use VPN software, or here's the wireless password, right? So if you generate a wireless WPA code, everyone's connection to that hotspot is encrypted, right? So even if your laptop or iPad is sending unencrypted data, you have a secure connection to that wireless hotspot that solves like 90% of the identity. So you can build it into the network deployment, not necessarily. While I think it's good to teach people as well.
Yeah. So Mike, I want to ask you. I mean, you're building these networks around the country. How are you thinking about this stuff as you build them?
I think they're incredibly. Oops, sorry. We're doing a couple different things, but by no stretch of the imagination have we even remotely cracked the code on this. We struggle with these same issues. If you think about a cable provider, we bring broadband to a home. The home doesn't typically move unless it has wheels on it. So it's secure in that regard, but introducing Wi-Fi hotspots opens up a whole new dynamic just for us. So we're learning, and some of the techniques that we're using is we've actually spent a lot of energy developing a connection manager software. So we encourage all of our customers to actually connect to our hotspots using a connection manager software because we do have it secure. We have a VPN basically built into it. We store their credentials there. And then what we also do is we make sure when they use our software, it's called Wi-Fi Finder for Time Warner Cable, we actually message to our customers that you're connected to Wi-Fi as opposed to when they're on a mobile device. One of the things that we've noticed just in normal consumer research is people no longer know how they're connected, right? The wireless networks are ubiquitous. And your connection manager softwares now, it used to be that a device would, you would have to tell it, connect here, connect there, connect to this, use, if you're on Verizon, use 4G versus Wi-Fi. Now with all the new apps out there, they'll do the connection changes for you. So they'll actually reach in, grab the radio of the phone, and make those changes. So one of the things that we've deployed is we actually put a little icon up in our own software that says you're on Wi-Fi right now. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing we do is when we deploy our actual access points, we deploy them with multiple SSIDs, and we have one that's publicly broadcasted, and then we have a non-broadcasted one, which allows us to connect in a secure fashion for our customers. So, and we don't have that on all our access points out, but we're trialing that right now out in Los Angeles in one of our markets out there.
So maybe it's useful to talk about the threats, the actual threats for a moment. Just not everyone in the room may understand how wireless sniffing works, and so it's useful to sort of walk through the issue. So the problem is that when someone connects to an open Wi-Fi network, anyone sitting near you can basically see what you're doing. The software that enables this is called a packet sniffer. It's actually built into many operating systems. If you have a Mac or a Linux computer, the software to do it is included. Otherwise, if you're using Windows, you can download it in about 5 minutes. Traditionally, this has been somewhat difficult to do. Packet sniffing is not trivially easy. And then a couple of years ago, a security researcher built a tool called Firesheep that sort of made packet sniffing and account hijacking a point-and-click affair. And so it's a Firefox plugin. It's been downloaded, I think, 2 million times now. So you install Firesheep, you go to Starbucks, you connect to the network, and then it presents you with a list of the names and accounts of people nearby. And so it says, the person next to you with this photograph, because it grabbed their Facebook photo, is connected to Facebook. This person's on Twitter. This person's on Yahoo. And the underlying, and then you just click on a button, and then it hijacks the account, and it logs in. It allows you to log in as them and view their private messages and send things to them. I mean, you own the account, essentially. And the underlying flaw here is that many popular consumer websites do not use SSL. SSL or HTTPS, this is the encryption that your bank uses. If you go to any website and you see the lock icon in the URL bar, that lock icon means the connection between your browser and the website is secure. It's used by all the banks. It's used by the credit card companies. Google started using it by default in 2010 for Gmail and started using it for other things, including search last year. Twitter uses it by default now. Facebook started using it a few months back. Hotmail's using it by default now, but there are still some websites that are not using it. Just maybe, I think 2 years ago, Senator Schumer from New York sent a letter to Amazon, Yahoo, and a couple other companies saying, hey, please turn on encryption by default. People's connections should be secure. And the problem is that not every website that consumers visit is secure. This means that you're not only exposed to people hacking your account, but even when you're not logging in, it means that the person nearby can see what you're doing. They can see which books you're looking at on Amazon's site. They can see which medical information you're looking at when you're browsing WebMD. And so, whether or not the Wi-Fi is open or closed, really what we want is for more websites to move to SSL. And it's worth noting that the nyc.gov website, in fact, doesn't use SSL either, which means that if you're browsing on that site for information about bed bugs, then someone nearby knows that you potentially have bed bugs. I don't live here, so I don't have bed bugs. But not only can government play a role in pushing companies, but government can also play a role in securing its own interactions with citizens. And I think, if you work at a company or you work at an NGO or you work in a government agency, you should check your own organization's website and make sure that it's secure by default so that people's interactions with your site are secure out of the box. That way they can actually use a Wi-Fi network, a public Wi-Fi network, to connect to your site, and so no one else will know what's going on there.
No responses there? So I want to relay two stories because I think that's very interesting, but that's sort of on that's on the server side, right? That's what Facebook and Amazon and you guys can do with your websites. But there is a push towards having these networks themselves be encrypted to use WPA encryption. And Chris, actually earlier you were talking about not wanting to have a login, not wanting to have an authentication screen. I used to write terms of service agreements when I was a lawyer, and my assumption was that no one would ever read them. I put it in all kinds of crazy shit just to see what I could get out of it. But you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to do that to a consumer. You don't want to say put up a splash page and say, to use the encrypted connection, you have to give us your login information. So I guess my question to you is, you want it to all happen on the server side and not on the connection side.
I'm not opposed to consumers being given anonymous VPN service. I'm not opposed to consumers being given disposable accounts that are not tied to their identity for security purposes. What I don't want is there to be a central record of you logging in that's tied to your identity or it's tied to some permanent device identifier. You should be able to sit down in the park, connect to a network, read some political material, and not have someone 6 months later be able to figure out who was reading that material, when, and where they live and which device they're using. Sorry.
AT&T is listening, and they're very mad at you.
Seriously, they got angry. And you don't actually need to do, like I said, you don't need to do server-side encryption. I actually disagree with Chris on the server-side encryption point, because I could still, if it's an open network, I can still trick all you guys to decrypt your, or let me decrypt your traffic. So, I don't think that's the solution. I think the carriers themselves. So this is the difference, and I think Chris made a really good description of it. But the difference between cable. All right, so like imagine a game of telephone where you and I have a string that we talk through, right? And so for someone to tap that string, they need to have physical access to that string and tap it, right? The alternative is we speak wirelessly and we just yell at each other across the room and everyone else can hear, right? And so what we can do is we can, in that yelling process, decide to use code words. Right? And I think that's the key. And I think you can actually do this in an open network, but just make it so that the web browser software or the actual Mac or iPad or whatever has encryption on it, and the network that the person that's receiving these messages have encryption on it. And you can do this in an open, anonymous way without requiring login, without requiring identity. It's actually like we have protocols like WPA, which is if you guys buy a Linksys router at home, you have WPA. It's like a $49 box, right? And on large scale deployments, there have been cases where there will be a splash page, like I was at Penn last week and they have this, right? You open to a public network, the public network says, thanks for joining, right? And in that page you can say, please use this password for the network. And by using that password, each individual gets a unique key. And you can do that dynamically. You don't have to actually do a bunch of heavy lifting.
So Michael, I want to ask you a question. You've been waiting patiently. Yes, you. I like your tie. I feel like you. So let's hypothesize that we build this perfect open network and it protects users and they're anonymous. What happens when, the small percentage of bad actors realizes that they have unfettered access to a network that protects their anonymity? Who's liable for whatever actions they might take? Do you have an idea?
This is not my area of expertise at
Yeah,
all.
but I thought you felt left out. I figured you
So could you repeat the question? So the
I'm
perfectly secure network.
I'm a master hacker,
Okay.
which is a dream of mine.
Okay.
And I know that I can go to the park, and in that park, I have open access to a network that won't track me. That you can't find my actions, which I think is good for a lot of people, for a lot of uses. But then there's this small set of bad actors. And so I'm anonymous, I can do bad things. What happens when I do those bad things? Where does that liability then fall? Do we just accept that as a price, as a cost?
Well, I think, so getting back to the notion of these free public networks that you're talking about, I think, I would pose the idea, or just put it out there of, is there a trade-off between having this public open network that's free, open to anyone, et cetera, and with that, free openness, freeness of the network, comes with these certain bad things that could happen to you. Then there are these, I guess, not private networks, but the ones where you subscribe to them, where you have more protections. I mean, is it a sliding scale, perhaps, between these open networks? When you do something out in public, you can't do certain things that you can do in private. There's a trade-off between the publicness of things and the privateness of things. That's just sort of going through my head. In terms of who liability, that's the sort of notion that's in my head about the sliding scale, perhaps.
Let me just pose this to the group then, because we cover this a lot at The Verge, right? There's anonymous exists as a force in this world, however you wish to define it. There's lots and lots of independent hacking groups that exist in the world, and some of them get caught, right? Sometimes they get caught, and they don't like it when they get caught, but sometimes they do. And oftentimes when they get caught is, the FBI goes and talks to the ISP, and they run a trace route, and they find them. And they find them usually at their home. But what happens when that is taken away, and you give some sort of, and I realize this is sensational in its way, but it's also real. I'm curious, what happens when you take away the ability to find these bad actors? If that is just a price that we're willing to pay for all the good that comes with the network, or if there's a solution to that problem.
You haven't taken anything away.
Okay.
So it's no different than if it's your network. I mean, the operator of the network still has traffic communications that they may have stored, that
But I've
they
taken
have
my
access.
laptop and I've left.
Well, people do that all the time on these other networks, but there are mechanisms for law enforcement to get communications traffic to help track and trace users, and we want those communications in place. And I mean, we went through this argument with the encryption debate way back when the government was saying we'll never be able to arrest the criminals because they'll use encryption, and thank goodness we won that one. But when a network is operating and if they're giving people accounts, this is communications traffic, and is going through a provider network.
Right.
And so there is a record of it. There is a way to trace it, just like if they're on a private subscribed network. It's not any different.
But
it's just that you're protecting the person that's out there using it for free.
Ashkan, I think you had
I think that's exactly right. So I think kind of at a higher level, I think we want to implement in technology a lot of the values we have in common society. And it's very expensive to be completely anonymous. It's very difficult. You have to be, as Chris said earlier, you have to be extremely skilled to be completely anonymous. But you can afford a level of anonymity that for most citizens is helpful, and for most law enforcement or bad actors is hard to defeat, right? Conversely, you can there are tools available to track down very bad actors. It just takes traditional police work or skill. You look at, I don't know if you guys follow this attack, this recent attack where a group of some people consider these super elite hackers from China attacked, all these networks, APT1, all this kind of stuff. They got caught, right, by Mandiant, and the way they got caught is that they employed very, impressive security hygiene, but then they checked their Facebook from some of the same computers when they were not employing those security. It was like standard, everyone's seen the heist movie where the really sophisticated European mobs will do something like go to the same bar because they like the bartender and get caught, right? So there's always traditional police work that will come into play here, and you can implement the values that we have or the balance we have in society around rights and freedoms in technology, and just maintain that so that the same normative values are present. It's just as difficult online to be anonymous. If you want to be really anonymous, it's just as difficult for law enforcement to find you as it is if I tag your building and run off to the next town today, which I'm not going to do.
Well, so just before my question, just to follow up on that, I think I actually wanted you to answer it, is that a moving target, that balance, right? Do you have to change it every day, month, week, hour? Not at a programmatic level, but as a normative level. The balance between how open we want our connections to be, how anonymous we're willing to be or we can be technologically, and how much it costs to be truly anonymous, right?
The decisions you make in the technology will enforce those values. And so what I'm saying in building those networks and building the policy around how those networks and how those technologies are implemented will dictate what those balances are and what those trade-offs are and what that target is. And I think we can do it with an eye to that, basically.
Yeah.
So what I would say here is that anonymity isn't a new thing, right? Our founding fathers wrote pseudonymous documents that were published under a name that was not theirs. They were worried that if they put their name to the writings, that they would be that the British would come after them, right? And this anonymity is a core American value. The communications technologies that we've been using for the last 200 years have allowed anonymity. You can mail someone something. You can put a document in a letter, in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it in the mail, and no one will know who the sender was, assuming that you put gloves on before you put it in the mail. You ask about this balance, but in fact, over the last 20 or 50 years, technology has made it so that anonymity is harder and harder. You used to be able to walk into a bookstore and buy a book with cash, and no one would ever know what you'd flipped through and what you'd walked out the store with. Yes, you can still do that in the vanishing bookstores, but increasingly, when you buy a book online, or even you browse a book online, or you browse materials online, you're leaving a trail of data behind that either companies are collecting for behavioral advertising reasons, or to optimize their site, or for many other reasons that then can be used against you down the road. I think that we do need to readjust things, and anonymity is slipping away from us, and we need technologies that facilitate anonymity for the average person. It's too difficult right now to be anonymous to the extent that you could be anonymous 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. I think we need to bring things back. And also, with regard to your question about sort of who's liable for this,
yeah.
If a bank robber uses a car for their getaway, Ford isn't liable for that. If a New York marijuana courier uses a bicycle to deliver drugs, the bicycle company isn't liable. I mean, the companies that provide communications and transport technologies are not liable unless unless they have knowledge of how these things are going to be used, and they're targeting that and cooperating. Internet companies just deliver packets, and they're not liable for their users' activities, whether they know whether they build their systems to not know what's going on. These are just modern communication services. They're no different than the post office before.
I don't think this norm can move.
Okay, Jody first, then.
Go ahead.
I don't think the norm should move. The dangerous thing is it has moved, and we keep moving it. It moved after September 11. And when I look at our country in relationship to Europe and many of the countries around the world, the amount of data now that our government has and the surveillance they have on our people is just simply alarming. And so I don't think, and some reason we think with this technology and what's capable, we should keep moving this norm. The norm was set by our founding fathers, and we need to stop moving the norm because I think it's becoming very dangerous. The countries that have had authoritarian regimes over in Europe, they have the most privacy protections. We've been the most democratic. We are coming to have the least.
I was going to use it. Is this on? Hello? No? On. Much better. I was going to use this, what Chris just said, to actually segue to our discussion of 6 strikes that began on the phone. For those of you who don't know, the 6 strikes program is a voluntary agreement among the largest ISPs that if you have 6 violations of copyright infringement, that they will choose to not sell you internet access anymore. I'm sure. Reported violations. Where we got into was that this gets to the lack of choice in wireline broadband access in America, and so you can't easily take your business across the street. And a lot of the things that we're talking about, in a prior life, I worked for a competitive provider, and we offered anonymous DSL. We created something called anonymous DSL and offered it, but we were the only ones. And as those choices have gone away, we as internet users have to be aware of what's lost in those exchanges due to the control. You know, I have one brand of bottled water here. I could walk into any deli down the street and find 6 other brands. How many other brands of broadband access do I have? If I want to run a server at my house, if I want to run a Wi-Fi hotspot and leave it open for my neighbors, for my friends, that is being dictated, those terms are being dictated by my provider. And I'm sure Mike will have something to say about that.
Nope. Well, so Bruce, let me ask you.
I tried.
So that gets to the heart of something that I think with public Wi-Fi is very interesting based on how you talked about how the city is building these things in partnerships with private industry, which in many cases is providing a retail product as well. So do you think about the public Wi-Fi as providing a competitive balance to AT&T, to AT&T's LTE product? Do you think about providing a competitive balance to Cablevision's Optimum at Home product? Or is that just off the radar?
I think when we think about public Wi-Fi, I think as was mentioned at the very beginning, there's really been over the years at least 2 different models of what the role of public Wi-Fi is. There was an original notion early on that sparked concepts in Philadelphia, San Francisco, and other places, that public Wi-Fi could literally be competitive, or rather an alternative to purchasing your own broadband at home, so that your main access to the internet would now be via a massive municipal Wi-Fi network that would be an alternative to your own home network from your cable company, your phone company, or an alternative. I think for the most part, again, the business plans behind those kinds of models foundered very quickly. Trying to set up that kind of network that had that kind of ubiquity and that kind of back-end support proved to be insurmountable without a huge amount of funding that no one was willing to commit to.
I'd like to point out, the ISPs also lobbied very, very hard against those networks.
That's true,
and
too.
And succeeded actually in passing laws in some states forbidding cities from building such networks.
That's certainly true, although to some extent those laws are also targeted, to some extent they're targeted to the Wi-Fi model, the wireless model, but they're also targeted to the wired model, the competitive sort of second wire built by the municipality. So I don't think that's so much a Wi-Fi specific concern as much as it is a competition concern generally, both wired, both landline and wireless. But in any event, I think the focus for most municipalities who are thinking about these issues today is more thinking about the public Wi-Fi not so much as a replacement for your home or business broadband, but rather as an outdoor or public space supplement, an amenity to people on the street. If you're taking your child to the playground and you want to take your laptop or your iPad or whatever it might be, or your smartphone, and you want to access a Wi-Fi network, you're able to do that. You're able to sit on a public bench and do that. Or you sit in a park, or as you're walking by, you may be doing, checking your email. You may be at an outdoor cafe. There's a million places to be. New York City happens to be a very outdoor, public, pedestrian-based city, and there's lots of places where people want to have that kind of wireless access. And I think we're tending to think about the future of public Wi-Fi focused more on that aspect of it than trying to create a yet an additional, competitive source to compete with what's happening
But I
inside
think
the
we've
home.
talked about, at least a little bit, about access as a fundamental necessity, right? So you're talking about it as an amenity, which is kind of at a different part of the spectrum. And I would say that the people who think of Wi-Fi as an amenity in the park are probably paying AT&T for LTE to begin with. And I actually know my wife, I looked at my AT&T bill, which was obviously metered and throttled all the time. And I said, why are we using so much bandwidth? And she had turned off her Wi-Fi. And she won't use it because the LTE is faster than her Wi-Fi at work. And she was tired of the pop-up telling her to join the Wi-Fi network. So if it's just an amenity, why don't we let AT&T and Verizon continue to build these networks that are serving people quite well?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things going on. When you get out into the public, you're talking about people who don't necessarily have or can afford AT&T LTE.
But that gets away from amenity. I guess I'm picking on that word a little bit.
Well, it becomes an amenity in the same sense that a water fountain becomes an amenity for people who don't want to buy bottled water.
For people who don't have water fountains. I was thinking of the taller water fountains.
It becomes an amenity for people who don't have alternative access, and that's one of the things that we're trying to accomplish. We want the public sidewalks, we want public spaces, public parks, public playgrounds to be useful to a large cross-section of people who don't necessarily have the most sophisticated, up-to-date connection to 4G. We want those people to be able to enjoy access to information in public spaces just the way they enjoy every other aspect of public spaces. Now, the city, as Deirdre mentioned, has a whole nother set of initiatives to bring people more affordable access to their homes and to their businesses, and to make sure that there's competition. And we work very hard on the wireline and the access to private spaces, and making sure that is also supplemented. So there's a lot of different initiatives going on. Just thinking about the public Wi-Fi piece, I think our focus has been more on the making this available to the public in the public space rather than the private space.
Sure. Just before we continue on, I just want to it's been 1 hour, I'm told. Well then. I just want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. Are we doing all right, Warren? Should we? Okay, cool. We'll carry on for a little bit then. Okay. So I just have some questions for you, Mike. Do you think about, when you supply free Wi-Fi, do you think of that as a bridge product into what you sell? Or do you think about it as being competitive? Do you worry about people just using the free product and never graduating?
We frankly don't provide a lot of free Wi-Fi. We actually do it here in New York City. But in our other markets, Time Warner Cable fundamentally thinks about this more from a convenience standpoint. And by that I mean we have 10 million plus broadband customers. The world is evolving with Wi-Fi enabled devices, and we want our customers to be able to stay connected to the internet. So we've I'm going to use a term, we've backed into Wi-Fi as a product enhancement to say to our customers who, if you think about the business we were in just a couple of years ago as a cable provider, the relationship we have with the customer, the transaction we have with them stops the second they walk out the front door, right? All their video, all their broadband, the phone services we provide are home or office-based. So we think about Wi-Fi more as a value-added service to drive our business.
Right.
And so therefore, we invest money, and we are investing millions and millions of dollars to build a Wi-Fi network so that we can keep our customers connected to the internet at the places where they go. So we are not building a ubiquitous network. We spend a lot of energy trying to figure out where people are going to be. Predictive models about, some of them are incredibly obvious. Parks, shopping plazas, some places that are not so obvious, like courthouses.
So do you want those networks to be competitive? I mean, when I walk out the door, my relationship with Time Warner ends,
Right.
and my relationship with Verizon begins, right? Because I have a Verizon wireless account. Do you think about your Wi-Fi offering as being competitive with whatever AT&T and Verizon or T-Mobile, I suppose,
Yeah,
are
very,
doing?
very much so.
And are you trying to grow that?
So we are trying to add value to our core product. So I think, yes, I mean, that's the way we're going to deploy our Wi-Fi network, is where we think of it fundamentally as an extension of our broadband network. Now, there are certain realities, right? There, you can't have the same exact speeds. We have to bring facilities out to these. We talked about on several different occasions. It's a shared service. It's unlicensed. It has limitations in terms of throughput and how that works. But we very much think about a model where people are paying us money. Our customers pay us good money for broadband service, and we are always looking for ways, whether it's a speed upgrade tier or an extension of the service, which is how we really think about Wi-Fi.
I just want to put a word in about unlicensed spectrum, since we haven't touched on that and we're getting short on time. Not so much from Time Warner's perspective, but all the mobile carriers have although they're very fond of using their licensed spectrum and terming politically that unlicensed spectrum is a giveaway to the public, but we've seen with Wi-Fi that we pioneered with NYC Wireless in various parks, and has now caught on, and everybody knows what it is. But a lot of people, even in this room, probably don't realize that 65% of data traffic on from mobile carriers is now being offloaded onto this unlicensed little piece of crappy spectrum. And so what we should all be pushing for is for more unlicensed spectrum, right? Because
You got Time Warner to agree with you, man.
Then this night has been worth it.
It was fiery. Well, it's better for them, right? Because
Just on that very point, I mean, we obviously are not, I mean, look, everybody's position is biased to what it is that is most self-serving to them.
Right.
We don't own licensed spectrum. So we've decided as a business that we're going to use Wi-Fi as a value driver and a differentiator. So we've actually been very active down in Washington lobbying for whether it's some of the spectrum that's coming available from the broadcast operators, stuff at the 5 gigahertz area. We absolutely agree that there needs to be more spectrum so all things in the Wi-Fi space can continue to grow, because we are running into huge problems at 2.4, and there's not enough devices right now at 5 gigahertz that you could sort of have a compelling experience at. But we absolutely think there should be more spectrum donate, it's the wrong word, more spectrum made available.
that's definitely the wrong word for you.
Exactly.
So I think, just to go to an earlier point that Bruce made, when you look at the cost and sustainability of these things, it's kind of important to actually look at the numbers, right? The Chelsea project was something like just over 100 grand, right? It was like 150.
We have somebody from Chelsea here.
Yeah, it was like, what is it, 75 grand and then 45 a year to run? 150, right? And so, and from a kind of an ad perspective, Google gets an impression every time someone logs into their, right? They don't see provided by Google when, yes. Yeah, right. So
But Google doesn't get paid for that.
They don't get paid for it, but for an ad, like, think about what Google pays in those numbers to put a big ad in front of Times Square, right?
Right.
So from a cost perspective, we're not talking about like huge numbers yet. We also have a lot of great technologies out there like mesh networking or kind of open access kind of stuff that would provide some of the infrastructure for this, right? But we don't see a lot of deployment or adoption by the municipalities. And I'm not the network neutrality guy. I wish there was, someone in the room, right?
I'll take it on.
Or like, or GG
We're not gonna get to all of it.
right. But I mean, there are policy kind of, if for example, if you guys wanted to provide, you could, for every access point you provide, you could slice off a piece of that bandwidth, right, and provide that as open access, right? So if I buy Time Warner cable, if my Wi-Fi router could set up an open access base network, a base station that people could piggyback on, or you can incentivize home users to create an open network, but you guys require a business line if you want to share your home DSL. So even if I wanted to create an open access network, I can. So there's a lot of like clever solutions and innovation that could happen in this space that we don't see. And I'm, again, not the network neutrality person, but I would argue that a lot of this, if you want to play devil's advocate, is around the kind of the lobbying and the lobbying interests to push these technologies to municipalities, right? You can almost take the same line of thinking for the electric car kind of paranoia and apply it, the same kind of framework to this debate, and you would see a lot of similarities for sure.
Well, just to provide a little historical perspective on what we're talking about with spectrum and what we're talking about with Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi exists is at the grace of the federal government saying we're going to unlicense this chunk of spectrum at 2 point. A tiny chunk, man. Have you seen a chocolate chunk? It's like that big. We're going to unlicense this bit of spectrum at 2.4, which is what Wi-Fi runs at, which is what Bluetooth runs at. Annoyingly, it's what an older microwave oven runs at, so if you have one of those garage door openers. And then there's another little like a smaller slice now at 5 gigahertz that's being used by like newer iPhones, newer routers. It's smaller, it has less range, but it's a bit faster because fewer people are using it. But if you go and ask, and we're sitting here talking about cities building entire networks for people using this tiny little bit of spectrum. But if you go to ask AT&T and Verizon, who own massive amounts of spectrum across the board, if you ask Sprint, they'll say AT&T is warehousing its spectrum. They're buying it, they're not using it. They will tell you over and over again that there is a spectrum crunch in this country, that they don't have enough to service their 22 million, well, AT&T is like 100 million. So their 100 million subscribers, they don't have enough, and that's why my calls drop every day. And they will tell you this over and over again when you can be in your apartment building or you can be in a public park in New York City using this tiny little bit of 2.4, and it's servicing the Wi-Fi needs of many. And so fundamentally what we're talking about is we're saying we're going to use Wi-Fi, maybe not as a direct competitor, but Time Warner is saying, well, we can use Wi-Fi, which we don't need a license for, to make it so that our customers don't have to use AT&T's network when they leave their home. They're still on our network. And that provides a tremendous amount of competitive advantage to them. And so the more you unlicense the spectrum, the more you allow other competitors to go there. I realize I'm the moderator and not the speaker, but this is the one place where I write angry screeds against AT&T and Verizon like once a month, so I felt compelled to jump in. Go ahead.
So I work with a group of lawyers, and generally I really, really like lawyers, particularly the ACLU lawyers, who are fantastic. But I will complain about lawyers for just one quick second. And so you mentioned that in a previous life you had written terms of service agreements. So in addition to the fact that no one reads these things, they actually block technology, and they block a specific kind of technology that I'll talk about briefly. So we have all these open Wi-Fi networks. Right now, you walk down the street and there's hundreds of coffee shops in New York that provide free Wi-Fi access. And unfortunately, many of them use captive portals, splash screens. So you connect to the network, you sit down, they present you with a page with a logo and a terms of service that no one's going to read, and then you click the OK button. And what this does is it pushes people to a certain style of Wi-Fi access. What it does is it means that for you to connect to their network, you need to invest enough time to click on the OK button and to load a screen in a browser. What this means then is if you're walking down the street, from one street to the next, you're walking a mile down a street in New York and you pass 10 different coffee shops, in theory, your device could hop onto each network for just 5 seconds, get your mail, get your Twitter updates or whatever, and then move on to the next network. We don't enable that kind of access right now because of these stupid terms of service policies. If the networks were truly
I quit
unlocked,
that job, man.
right? Well, but you're as the proxy lawyer on the panel, you're still responsible for
I got all
this.
kinds of lawyers here.
If we got rid of those useless terms of service agreements that no one reads, your device could intelligently look for open Wi-Fi networks, probe the web. If it got a valid connection, use it, and then when you're out of range, then look for the next network. But those terms of service agreements get in the way.
So allow me to tell one more story here, because that's really interesting. Because the wireless companies in this country are so dominant and so controlling, when Apple was first developing the iPhone, they went to Verizon first, and Verizon rejected Steve Jobs. They said, we don't want you to build the iPhone. It won't have Verizon logos on it. We don't want you to run your own apps, all this stuff.
Well, Jobs wanted $10 a month as well, right?
Yeah, and he's Steve Jobs. He wants a lot of things, or he wanted a lot of things. So they fought, and they waited years and years. And before AT&T signed up, their backstop plan was to build a Wi-Fi-only device that communicated over VoIP. They got really far with this, and then finally AT&T signed up, and they used edge networking, which if you had the first iPhone was very slow. But the reason they could never pursue the Wi-Fi plan as vigorously as would have enabled them to get with Verizon in the first place was because of some of these problems. They couldn't guarantee Wi-Fi access in many, many places. They couldn't build out a network of their own without relying on big providers. So it's interesting that we've been sitting here talking about public Wi-Fi, and the reason that I keep on bringing up the wireless providers, the traditional wireless providers, again and again and again, is because they're there. They're already providing this enormously pervasive mobile broadband experience. And the public Wi-Fi, as far as I can see it, is kind of amenity for many, many people. But until it becomes a competitive, feel free to disagree with me, but until it becomes competitive, I don't know that it will ever provide, you disagree with me too. All right.
But they're also getting a huge benefit from this Wi-Fi, the ubiquitous Wi-Fi networks. They're getting benefit from people.
Because they're offloading.
They're offloading. They couldn't handle the traffic that was generated from the birth of the iPhone, right? And so they're drowning. They're trying to offload as much data as possible. So if you're using Time Warner, they're thrilled. You're using their own. They're happy.
Okay, so I think this is actually good, since you disagree with me, I think this is a great time. By the way, I've been sitting here just needling everyone. I want you to know that I have an entirely different set of well-reasoned opinions that have nothing to do with what I've been saying. It's my job to irritate everyone in speaking.
Next time we'll trade.
I've done that too. Warren wasn't happy with that.
Nilay, let's go to Q&A. Just two quick announcements. One is that we are videotaping this, thanks to Jolie McPhee right here, who's doing a fantastic job, I'm sure, and does great videotaping for us generally. So just be aware if you do want to speak that you will be captured and waive all rights, etc.
He's got a great terms of service we decide.
So we were talking about wireless providers, and there was a piece recently on The Verge about consumers' attitudes.
What did I do now?
It was very enlightening, I thought. That consumers' attitudes towards their wireless providers, and this probably extends to their wireline providers as well, are shockingly apathetic. They care very little about, and I think the stats, we had to get to like 30% of a cost decrease before people would be willing to switch.
This is my piece, yeah.
This was your piece, yeah. And so when we're talking about the competitive aspect of all this and why the market isn't responding to what we see as poor service in certain respects, is it our fault? Is it the consumer's fault? Is this a problem of education? Is it a problem of expectation? So that's my question to the panel.
Your piece. Go ahead. You go first.
Well, just to explain what the piece was, T-Mobile announced a whole set of new plans, contracts and full device pricing, which if you're a mobile industry reporter, you've been advocating for in one way or another for 5 years. So we literally did a man on the street, walked around Bryant Park, and we asked people, how long have you had AT&T? How long have you had Verizon? Would you ever change? And the answer was always like 15 years, 5 years. And bizarrely, just in that piece, I asked everybody if they'd ever been in a relationship with a human being that long. And the answer was no. Like 100% of the time, people have been in a relationship with AT&T longer than their wife or whatever. And it was, just absolutely crazy to me. And I said, what would get you to switch? What is competitive for you? Like, would it be would T-Mobile have to come in at 30% cheaper? And they'd be like, and it wasn't devices. It wasn't like, would they have the iPhone or not? It was just like, I don't know, maybe my service would have to really suck. And what I learned from that was that internet service is essentially a fungible commodity, right? People don't think, I need an anonymous service. The consumer doesn't think, I need to make sure that no one's tracking me. The consumer doesn't think, I need to make sure this is secure in the right way. They just have it. They have it on these devices. And like Apple customers don't think they have a relationship with AT&T. They go to the Apple store to get it fixed. And that's like pervasive. And I think it's bad, but that's what we found. Yeah.
Couldn't you argue it's because you have lock-in that I can't just hop networks?
Oh yeah, no, my dream is that you open your phone and it shows you all the networks and you pick the cheapest one.
I do like device testing, so I have devices on all the networks and I have preferences, and I've tried them. But I don't think it's easy to sit there and say today I'm going to try AT&T.
No.
Or right, and so I think that you can't actually compare goods if there's high lock-in, right?
Right. So, yeah.
I think it's important to perspective here, and you found the perspective when you went out and did the man on the street interviews, and the notion of the sample of one, to look beyond the sample of one, and we are tech elites here talking about these issues. Who else would be here at 8:45 at night talking about these issues? So it's a very small subset of this tech elite thinking about this, and then there's a broad audience who are satisfied with their service. They just want it to work. They don't care about anonymous stuff, or they're more flexible in their privacy. They're just going to use the service that they find fun and useful. So it's in any sort of policy making that has to inform the debate, and to throw a label out there as uncompetitive or monopoly or oligopoly, those are elitist terms that to the normal consumers, they don't see the market that way. They see it as fine.
Well, this is why
it's enormously competitive
to bring up the notion of public Wi-Fi as competitive, right? Which, to great pushback, I would like to point out, I've maintained my staunch dedication to the idea that this is competitive. Because if access is fungible as some sort of commodity good, then the public Wi-Fi networks are there and people will use them. And they might not use AT&T, and AT&T might have to provide some other service to bring people back to that network, or provide some cheaper access or faster access or what have you.
We have to make a distinction between the mobile carriers and the wireline providers, because they're two different things. First of all, as a good friend would say,
50% of the cases.
First of all, as a good friend of mine would say, behind every wireless is a wire, right?
Yeah.
So you still have to backhaul that traffic some way, somehow. So Time Warner has to pay to backhaul their traffic, or any of the others. And if I want to, as an individual, share my Time Warner connection, I'm going to violate their terms of service to share it openly with my neighbor, right? So you have different issues. So you have a market. You have a market failure on the wireline side. That's clear. You have more of a market oligopoly oriented than it may be on the mobile side. And Wi-Fi is sort of blurring it, because I don't think it is a substitute. I think it's an add-on. It's an extension, but it's not as clear a substitute. You can't run a server off it. You can't sit there for 4 hours and do work easily in a Starbucks without drinking enough coffee to hurt yourself. So I just want to make that distinction.
Another question.
Michel Bizinski, I would like to know what do you think about the competitivity of the U.S. Versus other countries? Because I remember I attended Susan Crawford's presentation, and she mentioned that, for example, in South Korea, the level of equipment is much better than here. I can say that, for example, I live in New York. Sometimes I go to the JV Center, conference center. for a conference. There is no Wi-Fi access. There's not even wireless access on the phone. So you have the feeling when you're there for 2 days, you're kind of totally out of the world, and you are in New York. So I find that, there's something going on here. I would like to know what you think about that.
Well, I could say, I always think you should take any sort of international comparison with a grain of salt, just because it's hard to compare countries. South Korea is an incredibly dense country, a significant portion of the...
More dense than Manhattan?
I think so. It's significantly dense. And when you're thinking about from a national perspective, the U.S. is a very rural country with a very low population density compared to Korea, which is a very, very high. I think it's amongst the highest in the world. So, so those comparisons are imperfect. We always hear rankings. The U.S. is 8th or 9th or 10th or whatever. 16th, 20th, 100th.
Pick a number. As long as it's less than 10.
But it's also that focuses on the supply side of the issue, and the demand side, the usage side is equally as important. What are your top 5 South Korean apps that you use? What are these countries producing? What are they doing with these connections that the U.S. isn't doing? So that's I think part of the equation too, is to look at the entire piece here.
I would encourage everyone to ignore all of us on this panel and just look up. There's really good data by, New America, by Berkman Center on cost of broadband, cost of wireless services across different countries with similar regions, similar densities, and you'll see quite a bit of variance in terms of what it costs to just get a cell phone in Europe or a cell phone connection. So yeah, I would just look at the numbers.
Yeah, I would say when I did the what carrier do you have, what would you leave piece, I talked to somebody from London who had a bright yellow cell phone, so I beelined to talk to him. It was a Lumia. Anyway, but I said, well, what would you pay? What would be enough of a price difference to make you switch? And he looked at me and he goes, well, I get unlimited everything for £10 a month, so I guess it would have to be free. And that's all right. Well, that market is totally different. It's structurally different. It's much, much smaller, but the solutions they've come up with, because the markets are more competitive directly, you're just shaking your head at me?
No, but you could look at Sweden, you could look at,
Well, I'm just saying it's different, but they've arrived at a different end state.
So the reason that basically everyone other than the States is more competitive is because once a consumer invests in a device in the US, they can only use it on that wireless carrier. So the contracts aside, you've bought this device. The only thing you can do with it when you get sick of Verizon is put it on eBay.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, sorry, that wasn't intentional.
And we're done, everyone.
Fine.
It's been an excellent night.
Yeah, you can recycle the phone. Even with AT&T and T-Mobile, if you'd purchased this iPhone, for a long time, you could only use it on T-Mobile's 2G network.
Yeah.
And T-Mobile had to re-engineer their entire network just to try and stay competitive and switch to the same 3G spectrum that AT&T was using. Consumers in Europe can switch carriers with much greater ease. And because of the sort of hardware lock-in effect, US consumers are screwed, and it's only going to get worse with 4G, where different carriers have very, very different spectrum, and right now there's no device that has a radio that can do all. Are they coming?
But don't consumers in Europe pay the full cost of those devices?
Sure.
It's a different model in the U.S.
But
where
consumers in the U.S. pay the full
subsidized.
cost. They just pay it over time. But we do pay for the phones.
It's part of the
They're
business
not free.
model.
but then you can't take the phones.
And then in the U.S., once you've paid for the phone, you cannot use it in any way you choose to use it.
I feel like I've hijacked this panel and only ever talking about mobile carrier issues, which is, I'm sorry. It's just what happens when I'm around. Go ahead. Oh, there's other questions. Hey.
So throughout the course of the conversation, there seems to be a bit of an ebb and flow between the kind of privacy that people expect on communication systems and universal access.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, Walmart is deploying some systems inside their stores which will track their customers through the store by looking for the places that the phones will connect with wireless access points and then track them by their MAC ID, which even if you use HTTPS, you're not really protected. So I'm just curious, especially opinions from the people on the ACLU side of this stuff. If we were to provide something like universal access for wireless internet, what is your perspective on what that means in terms of eroding actual privacy? Because you can track people. The CIA recently claimed that having a phone in your pocket, just by seeing the way that the phone moves from the way that you walk, they can track you and figure out who you are from the gait in your walk. So add that, also by knowing the MAC ID of the phone that's in your pocket while you're walking around the city. I'm curious what your perspective is in terms of privacy on that, in addition to like the altruistic goal of providing wireless access for everybody.
Do you want to talk about this since you know more about technology? Or okay,
Yeah.
do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll describe the technology. So he's talking about two companies. One is Path Intelligence. The other is Euclid Elements. Path Intelligence is, they set up network-based, so GSM-based sniffers, as Chris was describing before, to look for the unique serial number that your phone puts out. The other is Euclid Elements, who's in a bunch of different malls currently, that look for the MAC address, and they can uniquely identify a specific device. So each device you buy has a unique serial number for the life of the device, and that's enough to track consumers. So what they do is they sell maps when you go to the mall. They like, this person hung out by the checkout, so they probably checked out, they probably bought something, or this person hung out in front of Victoria's Secret a lot and they came back the next day and they bought some stuff. So you can figure out if your displays are working or if your products are laid out well. This is this really weird gray area where Senator Franken just sent out a bunch of letters to these companies saying, for example, if you were compelled by law enforcement, if I have your device, can law enforcement ask, have you been here? And these carriers could, or these service providers could essentially tell law enforcement your whereabouts historically and they keep that data for long periods of time. The technology itself has all these implications, right? So these become portable tracking devices for sure. The question is, as you build these networks for public, you might have some public policy statements or restrictions to make sure that companies like this don't actually use the technology in this way in your municipality, right? So these are in this gray area of the law that hasn't really been fleshed out. And so with Google Wi-Fi and Street View, they're able to actually collect this data without falling under wiretap laws based on that decision, on the FCC decision. And so this is this gray area, I think, that as a municipality you can actually have some insights to or provide some guidance to.
So it's a really good question. The two technologies that Ashkan described, one uses the cell phone system and uses the device IDs of your cell phone. The other uses Wi-Fi networks and uses the device ID of your wireless card. The law is really clear when it comes to the cell phone sniffing that if you were to set up base stations in a store and sniff the cell phone spectrum just for the device IDs, whether or not that is secure or not, there is a really good argument to be made that that's what's called an illegal pen register. They're intercepting and sniffing spectrum they shouldn't be sniffing. And unfortunately, for the folks to go after the people, or for the people doing that to be held accountable, we would need a state or federal prosecutor to open an investigation. It would be really good for that to happen. Obviously, several senators have sent nasty letters, but the next step is for an AG to look into this and nail the company to the wall. On the Wi-Fi front, there are mixed opinions as to whether sniffing Wi-Fi is an interception or not. The class action lawyers who were suing Google over the Google Street View stuff argued that in fact it was an illegal interception. Google said otherwise. The state AGs were able to get Google to give them some money, but Google actually never admitted that they'd done anything wrong, and Google ended up having to put out...
But that's smacked in Europe, right? Pretty hard.
Well, but Europe has different interception laws.
Well, I'm just saying.
Okay, so here in the US, we don't really have solid case law on whether it is illegal to intercept Wi-Fi traffic, particularly non-content Wi-Fi traffic. As a practical matter, given that every laptop that's made can do this, it's difficult to keep the tools out of people's hands. The tools to do this on the cell phone network are in fact more difficult to get, and they cost a little bit more money, maybe $1,000 per device to do this. It's troubling this technology exists. I think it's also important to differentiate between the location tracking that your cell phone company can do. You have a contractual relationship with them. they may not be doing it for your benefit, but at least they're the ones providing you service with all these other third parties who are tracking you without your knowledge, consent, and not in any way providing any benefit to you. At the very least, I would hope that if these companies are doing this, they're providing clear notice to consumers when you walk in the mall or you walk in the store. They're letting you know that this is going on, and they provide you with an easy method of opt-out. I mean, ideally, I would think they should require an opt-in. Of course, no one would ever opt in, but they should at least offer that. But unfortunately, no, not in terms of service. They should tell you. I mean, I'm not talking about a 20-page document stapled to the wall, but there should be a clear sign saying, "Warning: we're tracking everything you do in the store. And if you don't want that, press this button, or do something simple." You shouldn't be required to crawl through glass to be able to opt out of tracking. Opting out should be easy.
Do you want to mention the wireless?
Let's take one more question.
Okay, hi, I'm Jody. I'm with the Internet Society. I've got two questions basically for the city reps. And first one briefly is just white spaces versus Broadway. What's the state of play? I saw that it just came up in the last few days. And the second one is really about the Verizon contract and Fios. And we're looking at Kansas City, where the deal is, everybody gets, all you've got to do is pay for the device and you get free internet, and then you can scale it up. Looking at that, do we wish that we'd done a better deal with Verizon back when we had the chance? And then, they did build a Wi-Fi network for the whole city. It's just that nobody can use it except emergency and Department of Environment Protection and this kind of thing. Is there spare capacity on that thing that could in fact be repurposed?
That's a lot of questions. White spaces, I think the city's position is that it is important to protect the interests of institutions like Broadway theaters, concert promoters, and other folks who use the wireless microphones and so on. It is also important that we maximize the availability of public Wi-Fi spectrum. So we hope that the FCC will will take care to make sure that both of those interests are protected using the best available technology. With respect to Google, we've had a lot of conversations with Google about what they can do in New York. It's not as easy to build networks in New York City as it is in certain locations around the country. Google has its own business plan that they're pursuing, and we continue to be open to further discussions about increased competition in the city. But we also are very happy to have Verizon building a fiber to the home system, which will be very powerful here. That should be completed in the next couple of years, and we will have one of the most powerful, competitive, head-to-head wireline sets of networks here, with Time Warner competing against Verizon in some areas and Cablevision competing against Verizon. So we do believe we've done a pretty good job in creating competition here in the city.
Right.
Better than monopoly.
That's quite a line.
And you had a third question.
The existing public, the existing...
NYCwin. NYCwin is not, right, NYCwin is not a Wi-Fi network. It's licensed spectrum that's used for public safety and other government uses. It would be a very serious challenge to try and integrate that public safety and government use network with sort of open public access. But again, we're looking at a whole variety of avenues to try and make open public networks available to folks around the city.
Hey, Dana Spiegel from NYC Wireless. Regarding white spaces, just as a comment, it doesn't make a difference what the city says or wants or anything. Google has a map that says that there's no white space channels available in New York City in all 5 boroughs as a result of the Broadway lobby. So you can check out the map yourself. Google makes it available. But it's great that the city has a position, but it really wouldn't make a difference given what the FCC regulations are for white space regulations and registration. So there's not a chance in hell that we're ever seeing white space use in New York City. But my question for you, Bruce, and not to hammer on you a little bit more, but you mentioned a little bit about Verizon Fios and what a wonderful program that we negotiated with them. And my question is really around, are they actually going to finish this? And what is the city doing to make sure that Verizon is held accountable for 100% of what they agreed to in the franchise agreements that you guys negotiated on behalf of us, the citizens? Because it's not a couple of years from now that they're supposed to be finished. They're supposed to have fully built it out by the end of 2013. That means, I think, 95 to 100% coverage of every single consumer.
It's incorrect. It's July 2014.
Okay, 2014, sorry. So add another 6 months onto my erroneous comment. So a year, so 14 months from now, Verizon is supposed to have complete coverage of every single, I believe it's every single residence in New York City. All 5 boroughs, all 230, 270 square miles of whatever New York City is made up of. And as far as I'm aware, the network that they're building is neither fiber to the residents, nor is it ever going to come close to actually meeting the requirements that you guys negotiated on our behalf. And I want to know what the city is doing and what it's reporting publicly to us, your citizens, about what you're actually doing to hold Verizon's feet to the fire.
Okay, let me make sure there's a general understanding of what Verizon's obligations are. Verizon is obligated to pass 100% of the homes, 100% of the residences by July of 2014. That does not mean they have to get upstairs to every apartment by July 2014. That is an additional major project that took Time Warner and Cablevision many years to accomplish. Verizon, we want to make sure that they have that investment in infrastructure through the streets by the time that they're supposed to get done. We've been tracking their compliance with that. We believe
Where?
I'm sorry, where?
Where is it being tracked, and why is it not being published to the public?
We talk to Verizon, we follow what they're doing, we try and make sure that they're in compliance, and we continue to do that.
Well, you didn't really answer the question.
He's talking about transparency.
Where can I, as citizen, get information about what Verizon's coverage of their fiber to the street project?
There's on our website, the full franchise agreement, the final page has every borough, every year, the percentages they have to pass, and we track that. So that's where they are. If you want more specifics, you can give us a ring. We'll let you know. But yeah, it's on the website.
Who are you?
Email to you.
Who are you?
Nick Spordone from DoITT, Communications Director.
So you guys are publishing this information?
It's on the website if you'd like me to email to you. Or
And it's up to date?
It is up to date as the end of every year, so as of the end of 2012.
Okay, let's move on. Hi, I'm Peter from Access. I just wanted to put a couple things out there. First of all, I think universal access is a fundamental right in the U.S. and it's made our telephony system in the past the envy of the world. And want to know how that right can be preserved in the digital age, of what municipal Wi-Fi can do to preserve that, especially access to emergency services. Related, I wanted to ask about the mesh networking, how the cities can promote use of mesh networking, how telcos can allow it, and I think the use of commotion wireless in the Hurricane Sandy relief effort showed the potential for that here and now.
You're talking about AT&T and T-Mobile teaming up during the Sandy relief stuff?
I'm doing the deployment of the commotion mesh networking tool.
That's right.
Byzantium.
Yeah. I built one economy using mesh networking in Nitro buildings up in the Bronx. You want to get this one? Yeah. Hang on. I was just going to, do people know what mesh networking is? Everyone? It's just like my device can talk to his device, and he's got an internet connection, and so I can get on through his internet connection, and he can connect to me. So we all kind of, it's kind of like communism for networking.
Yeah. Okay. I will say, just to respond to the universal access piece directly, that did make America's telephony network the envy of the world when AT&T was building a copper line telephone network throughout the vast expanse of America. In New York City, that fee to me is just a tax to like lay copper in antenna. So I think there's a balance there, and it's the USF, the FCC is pushing it to go from paying for a telephone system to paying for internet access, and that project is moving slowly. Okay. Warren, Jameson, they've gone.
No.
Dan, oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think we appreciate it. I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. I think it was a really terrific.
Yeah, thanks everyone.